The bomber is falling behind. High above occupied Europe at more than 20,000 feet, a B-17 flying fortress drifts out of formation. One engine coughs black smoke. Another is already shut down. Flak bursts pepper the sky around it. Dark, violent flowers blooming in the thin air. Inside the aircraft, the crew knows what this means. A lone bomber is a dead bomber. German fighter pilots below see it instantly. The tight defensive box has opened. One fortress is exposed, slow, damaged, and struggling to keep altitude. To them, it looks like a sitting duck. They roll in to attack. From above and behind, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs dive through the bomber stream, cannons flashing. Tracers streak past the cockpit windows. The aircraft shudders as rounds punch through aluminum skin. Somewhere in the fuselage, oxygen hisses into nothingness. But the fighters don't stay above. They drop lower. For months, Luftwaffe pilots have learned the fortress's secret weakness. The B-17 bristles with guns, nose, waist, tail, top turret, but beneath the aircraft lies a blind spot, a place where defensive fire thins, a place where fighters can slide underneath, pull up, and rake the bomber's belly with cannon fire. That's where they aim now. The German pilots roll inverted, climbing toward the bomber's underside, confident. They've done this before. They know what happens next. Inside the B-17, the crew braces. Then something moves beneath the aircraft. A steel and glass sphere lowers into the freezing slipstream. It rotates smoothly, almost delicately, as if awakening. Inside it, a single gunner curls into a fetal position, knees pulled tight to his chest, hands gripping twin 50-caliber machine guns. The ball turret is alive. As the fighters close in, tracers suddenly rise from below. Not wild, not panicked, but deliberate. Two streams of heavy machine gun fire arc upward, converging on the attackers. One fighter jerks violently, smoke pouring from its engine. Another peels away, its pilot stunned by a threat that wasn't supposed to exist. The hunters scatter. The underside of the fortress, once a death sentence, has become a trap. For the gunner inside the ball turret, there is no room to celebrate. He is alone, sealed into a rotating sphere barely larger than his own body. Below him is nothing but open sky. If the landing gear fails, he cannot escape. If the aircraft crashes, he will be the last to know, and the first to die. But in this moment, his guns are speaking. The ball turret was never comfortable, never safe, never forgiving. But it was deadly. And for enemy fighters who once believed the B-17 was helpless from below, it delivered a brutal lesson, one written in tracer fire, spinning wreckage, and sudden fear. The flying fortress was not a sitting duck, and the most dangerous defense it carried hung beneath its belly. The B-17 flying fortress was born from a bold idea, one that many believed was reckless. In the 1930s, U.S. Army Air Corps planners envisioned fleets of heavy bombers flying deep into enemy territory in broad daylight, striking factories, rail yards, and oil refineries with precision. They believed massed formations of bombers, bristling with machine guns, could defend themselves without fighter escort. It was a theory built on confidence and on necessity. Early American fighters simply didn't have the range to escort bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany and back again. If daylight bombing was going to work, the bombers would have to survive on their own. The B-17 was designed for that mission. It was large, rugged, and heavily armed for its time. By the middle of the war, a typical B-17 carried up to 13 50-caliber machine guns, covering nearly every angle of approach. Crews trusted its reputation for durability. Stories circulated of fortresses returning to base riddled with holes, engines shot out, entire sections of tail missing. But reputation didn't tell the whole story. Early bombing raids over Europe were brutal. Unescorted bomber formations suffered catastrophic losses at the hands of the Luftwaffe. German pilots were experienced, aggressive, and tactically sophisticated. They studied American formations carefully, identifying weaknesses and exploiting them with deadly efficiency. The skies over Europe became killing grounds. In missions like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, entire bomber groups were mauled. Crews were lost not because the B-17 lacked guns, but because those guns couldn't cover every angle equally. Formation flying helped. Tight boxes of bombers overlapped fields of fire, creating zones of mutual protection. But formation discipline could only do so much. Damage, weather, flak, and human error constantly broke formations apart. And once a bomber drifted out of position, it became vulnerable. German fighters attacked in coordinated waves. Some dove head-on to exploit closing speed. Others attacked from the rear, targeting engines and control surfaces. But one approach proved especially effective and especially dangerous for American crews: the underside. The B-17's belly was difficult to defend. Early models had no powered turret below the aircraft. Gunners in the waist position struggled to depress their weapons far enough to engage fighters climbing from beneath. Pilots knew it, crews knew it, the enemy knew it too. By 1942, Luftwaffe pilots routinely attacked from below and behind, firing upward into fuel tanks, bomb bays, and crew compartments. A few seconds of accurate cannon fire could cripple a fortress beyond recovery. Losses mounted. The promise of the flying fortress, self-defending, unstoppable, resilient, was in danger of collapsing under the reality of modern air combat. Something had to change, and the answer would come not from better flying or tighter formations, but from turning the bomber's most vulnerable angle into its most dangerous surprise. To the men of the Luftwaffe, the American heavy bomber was both a challenge and an opportunity. The B-17 was tough, but it was not fast. It climbed slowly, turned poorly, and followed predictable routes. Once committed to a bombing run, it had limited ability to maneuver. For experienced fighter pilots, those weaknesses were invitations. German intercept tactics evolved quickly. Early in the war, fighters attacked from the rear, staying just outside effective gun range and firing in long bursts. Losses followed, but so did lessons. The bomber's defensive fire was dense behind and above. Approaching from those angles meant flying directly into converging machine gun streams, so the Luftwaffe adapted. Head-on attacks became common. Fighters dove straight toward the bomber formations, firing heavy cannons at the cockpit and nose, then breaking away at the last moment. The closing speed was enormous. A single pass could kill pilots or disable controls, but head-on attacks were dangerous even for the attacker. Timing had to be perfect. Defensive gunners still had a chance to fire. Collisions were a real risk. Then German pilots found the most dangerous angle of all, from below. Approaching beneath a bomber offered several advantages. The B-17's silhouette was harder to see against the ground. The guns covering the underside were limited, and the aircraft's most vulnerable components, fuel tanks, bomb bay, and crew stations, were exposed. Fighters would slide under the formation, then climb gently, firing upward with 20mm and 30mm cannons. These shells didn't just punch holes, they exploded inside the aircraft. A single hit could ignite fuel vapors or detonate bombs. Crews sometimes never knew what hit them. Losses from belly attacks were devastating. Entire aircraft vanished in fireballs. Others dropped out of the sky trailing smoke and debris, their crews trapped inside. Survivors in other planes watched helplessly as friends disappeared beneath them. The psychological effect was brutal. Bomber crews felt hunted. They could hear cannon shells tearing through the fuselage from below, a direction they could barely respond to. Waist gunners twisted awkwardly, straining to depress their guns. Pilots tried to weave slightly, but the bomber's size limited evasive action. It often wasn't enough. German fighter pilots grew confident in this tactic. Training emphasized underbelly approaches. Squadrons refined timing and spacing. For a time, the B-17's reputation as a flying fortress began to crack. The Luftwaffe believed they had found the bomber's fatal flaw, and for a while they were right. American losses climbed. Mission after mission returned with gaps in formations, empty spaces where aircraft and crews should have been. Some raids lost a quarter of their bombers in a single day. Strategic bombing itself was at risk. If losses continued at that rate, daylight raids would become unsustainable. Either tactics would change, or the campaign would fail entirely. The threat was clear. The enemy had adapted, and unless the bomber adapted too, the skies over Europe would remain a slaughterhouse. Every weapon system has a weakness. For all its guns and armor, the B-17's greatest vulnerability was not in its engines or wings. It was in geometry. The flying fortress was designed around the idea of overlapping fields of fire. Nose guns covered head-on attacks. Waist gunners protected the sides. The tail bristled with defensive fire. A top turret guarded against diving fighters. But beneath the aircraft, the coverage thinned. Early B-17 models had no dedicated gunner below the fuselage. Defense of the belly relied on waist gunners leaning awkwardly over their weapons, trying to depress barrels far beyond what they were designed to do. Their firing arcs were limited. Their view was obstructed by the aircraft's structure. Their response time was slow. From the outside, the weakness was obvious. From the inside, it was terrifying. Bomber crews knew that an attack from below often came without warning. Fighters climbing from beneath were harder to spot. Against the ground below, their silhouettes blended in. By the time gunners heard cannon fire tearing upward through the fuselage, the attacker was already pulling away. This blind spot turned the underside of the fortress into a killing zone. German pilots exploited it ruthlessly. They approached low, fired upward, and disappeared. They learned exactly where to aim. Bomb bays, fuel tanks, cockpit floors. Hits here caused catastrophic damage. Fires spread instantly. Aircraft broke apart in seconds. For bomber crews, there was nothing worse than knowing where the danger was and being unable to stop it. Waist gunners reported the same frustration again and again. They could see fighters slipping under the aircraft but couldn't bring their guns to bear in time. Some fired blindly, hoping luck would do what design could not. Luck rarely did. The psychological impact of the blind spot was immense. Crews spoke of it in hushed terms. Beneath them lay empty sky and death. Once a fighter was underneath, there was often nothing they could do but brace and pray. This weakness shaped tactics on both sides. Bomber formations tightened, trying to cover each other's bellies. Pilots adjusted altitude and spacing. Gunners strained constantly, scanning below despite knowing their limits. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, refined the approach. They attacked from angles that minimized exposure to defensive fire, often coordinating multiple fighters to overwhelm a single bomber's defenses. The Flying Fortress, for all its strength, had an Achilles heel, and as long as that blind spot existed, no number of guns elsewhere could compensate. American engineers and commanders understood the problem. Reports from combat zones were blunt. Losses from belly attacks were unsustainable. The bomber's defensive concept was incomplete. If daylight bombing was to survive, the fortress needed eyes and firepower beneath it. The solution would be extreme. It would be cramped. It would be dangerous. And it would place a single airman in the most exposed position imaginable. But it would end the myth of the safe approach from below. The answer to the B-17's most dangerous weakness was not elegant. It was desperate. By 1941, American engineers and commanders were facing an uncomfortable truth. If they could not defend the bomber's underside, daylight strategic bombing might collapse under its own losses. The solution would have to cover a wide arc, react instantly, and deliver overwhelming firepower, all while fitting into the narrow confines of a bomber already crowded with men, guns, and equipment. The result was radical. A rotating sphere mounted to the belly of the aircraft, transparent panels for visibility, 2 heavy machine guns, and 1 man sealed inside. The Sperry ball turret was unlike anything else in the air. Designed by the Sperry Gyroscope Company, the turret was a powered, retractable ball made of steel and plexiglass, capable of rotating almost completely around its axis. It could track fighters approaching from nearly any angle below the aircraft, precisely where the B-17 had been most vulnerable. But innovation came with a price. The turret was tiny, barely large enough for a man curled inside. To fit, gunners had to be small, often the shortest crew members available. Once inside, they pulled their knees up toward their chest, locked themselves into a harness, and became part of the machine. There was no room to stand, no room to stretch, no room to panic. When deployed, the turret dropped into the slipstream beneath the bomber, placing the gunner directly over open sky. The only thing separating him from a fall of thousands of feet was glass, steel, and trust in the aircraft above. The danger wasn't theoretical. If the landing gear failed to deploy, the ball turret gunner could be crushed during landing. If the turret was damaged and jammed, the gunner might be trapped. Emergency escape was difficult, sometimes impossible, especially if the aircraft was spinning or on fire. Many airmen were terrified of the turret before they ever flew in combat. And yet, it worked. The ball turret transformed the underside of the B-17 from a blind spot into a kill zone. Fighters approaching from below were now met with immediate, accurate fire. The rotating sphere allowed the gunner to track targets smoothly, even as the bomber maneuvered. German pilots noticed quickly. The safe attack angle was no longer safe. Reports from the field showed a marked reduction in successful belly attacks once ball turrets became standard. Losses didn't disappear, but they dropped. The bomber's defensive envelope was finally complete. The decision to adopt the ball turret reflected a hard truth of the air war. Survival demanded sacrifice, not just of comfort, but of personal safety. One crewman would bear extraordinary risk so the rest might live. The Flying Fortress was becoming what its name promised, not invincible, but defended from every direction. The ball turret was a marvel of compact engineering, and a nightmare of human endurance. At first glance, it looked impossibly small, a metal and plexiglass sphere barely 4 feet in diameter, hanging beneath the belly of the bomber. But inside that cramped shell was one of the most advanced defensive systems of its time. The turret was powered, not manual. An electric motor allowed the sphere to rotate smoothly in nearly every direction. The gunner controlled it with foot pedals and hand grips, turning the entire ball to track enemy fighters. Unlike flexible machine guns mounted in windows, the ball turret moved with mechanical precision. It could follow a target continuously, even as the bomber itself maneuvered. Mounted inside were two Browning 50 caliber machine guns, angled slightly apart to widen the cone of fire. These were the same heavy weapons used throughout the bomber, capable of shredding fighter aircraft with a few accurate bursts. The guns were gyro-stabilized. This mattered enormously. At 20,000 feet, with the bomber buffeted by flak bursts and turbulence, firing accurately was difficult. The gyro system helped keep the guns aligned with the gunner's aim, reducing drift and allowing sustained fire even during evasive movement. Visibility was another critical advantage. The turret's plexiglass panels gave the gunner an unobstructed view of the sky below and around him. Fighters approaching from beneath, once nearly invisible, now stood out clearly against the ground. The gunner often saw them first. That early warning saved lives. As soon as a fighter appeared below the formation, the ball turret gunner could open fire, forcing the attacker to break off or risk flying directly into converging machine gun streams. The firing arcs were devastating. The ball turret covered the entire underside of the bomber and extended into the lower quadrants of the aircraft's sides. When combined with waist and tail guns, it eliminated the last major gap in the fortress's defensive envelope. No approach was safe anymore. Operating the turret, however, was physically punishing. Temperatures at altitude dropped far below freezing. The turret was poorly insulated. Gunners wore electrically heated suits and thick gloves, but cold still seeped in. Frost formed on the inside of the plexiglass. Fingers stiffened. Muscles cramped. Communication was limited. The gunner was isolated from the rest of the crew, connected only by intercom. In combat, he fought alone, scanning constantly, calling out contacts, firing in short, disciplined bursts to conserve ammunition. If the aircraft was hit, the turret took the brunt of it. Fragments and tracer rounds often struck the sphere directly. The gunner could hear rounds hitting the armor, feel vibrations ripple through the structure. There was nowhere to hide. Emergency procedures were terrifying. If the turret jammed in the down position and the aircraft needed to land, the gunner had to be extracted through a narrow hatch while the bomber circled, or risk being crushed on touchdown. In some cases, crews were forced to belly land or ditch at sea because they could not retract the turret. Despite these risks, the system worked exactly as intended. Enemy pilots learned quickly that approaching from below was no longer a free kill. Even a brief burst from twin 50s could cripple a fighter. Survivability increased not because the bomber became invulnerable, but because attackers could no longer exploit certainty. The ball turret didn't rely on speed or maneuver. It relied on denial. It denied the enemy a safe angle of attack. And in the brutal arithmetic of air combat, that changed everything. The ball turret did not just change tactics. It changed who was asked to bear the war. The gunner inside the turret was usually the youngest man on the aircraft, often barely out of high school. He was almost always the smallest. Height and weight limits weren't preferences, they were requirements. If you were too tall, too broad, or too stiff in the joints, you simply didn't fit. Those who did fit learned quickly what that meant. Before every mission, the ball turret gunner climbed down into the sphere while the aircraft was still on the ground. He folded himself inside, knees up to his chest, boots resting on narrow stirrups, hands wrapped around the gun grips. Once the hatch closed, there was no standing, no stretching, no turning around. The Sperry ball turret was unlike anything else in the air. Despite the fear, despite the reputation, men continued to climb into the ball turret mission after mission. They did it because someone had to, because without them, the bomber was vulnerable, because their presence saved lives. Veterans later spoke of a strange pride, not in comfort, not in safety, but in necessity. The ball turret gunner was not glamorous. He was rarely seen in recruitment posters, but within bomber crews, his role was understood with absolute clarity. If he failed, everyone paid. If he succeeded, no one might ever know, except the fighter that never made it home. The first time a German fighter pilot was hit from below, it was a shock. For months, the underside of American bombers had been a place of advantage, a blind zone where cannon fire could be delivered with relative safety. Pilots trained for it. They trusted it. Some even preferred it. Then suddenly, it wasn't safe anymore. As ball turrets became standard equipment on B-17s, Luftwaffe pilots began encountering accurate, concentrated fire from directions they hadn't expected. Approaches that once ended in clean attack runs now ended in tracer streams rising directly toward them. Fighters were damaged. Some were shot down outright. The psychological effect was immediate. Pilots who survived these encounters reported surprise and confusion. The bomber beneath them was no longer passive. It was actively hunting them. The defensive perimeter of the flying fortress had expanded, and it followed them wherever they tried to go. Tactics had to change. German fighters began attacking from greater distances, firing rockets or heavy cannons from outside effective machine gun range. Others returned to head-on attacks despite the risks. The era of casual underbelly approaches was over. This shift bought bombers time. Every second an attacker spent adjusting tactics was a second the formation held together. Every fighter forced to break off was a bomber that stayed airborne. Ball turret fire rarely made headlines. It didn't always produce dramatic kill claims, but it denied the enemy what they needed most: certainty. The Luftwaffe could no longer rely on a guaranteed safe approach. Every angle carried risk. Every pass could be fatal, and in air combat, risk multiplies quickly. As bomber survivability improved, formations grew tighter, crews trusted their defenses more, mutual support increased, defensive fire became more disciplined, more coordinated. The ball turret was central to that confidence. It also disrupted timing. German attack plans relied on predictable responses. Once those responses changed, coordination suffered. Fighters broke off prematurely. Attacks lost synchronization. Opportunities slipped away. The bomber stream did not become invulnerable, but it became harder to break. This had cascading effects. Fighter losses mounted, experienced pilots were lost. Training pipelines struggled to replace them. The Luftwaffe faced growing pressure on multiple fronts, defending cities, factories, and supply lines while contesting the skies against increasingly resilient bomber formations. The ball turret was not the sole reason for this shift. Long-range fighter escorts, improved radar, and evolving tactics all played critical roles, but the ball turret closed a door the Luftwaffe had relied on, and once closed, it never fully reopened. What had once been a sitting duck now fought back from every direction, and for enemy fighters who learned too late, the lesson was lethal. Confidence in combat is fragile. Early in the bombing campaign, bomber crews climbed into their aircraft knowing the odds were against them. They trusted their training, trusted their formation, but deep down, many believed survival was a matter of chance. The enemy seemed to control the engagement. The ball turret helped change that. Knowing the underside of the aircraft was no longer defenseless altered how crews felt during missions. Attacks from below no longer triggered the same helpless dread. Instead of bracing for impact, crews listened for the ball turret gunner's callouts and the sound of his guns firing. That sound mattered. It was reassurance. It was resistance. It was proof that the bomber was not passive. Crew coordination improved. Pilots maneuvered with greater confidence, trusting that defensive fire covered every quadrant. Gunners communicated more effectively, handing off targets, calling threats early. The bomber became a unified system rather than a collection of isolated positions. This psychological shift reduced panic. Fear didn't disappear, but it became manageable. Crews focused on tasks rather than imagined worst-case scenarios. Discipline held under pressure. Formation integrity improved. The presence of the ball turret also reinforced trust in leadership. Crews saw tangible evidence that their experiences were being heard, that engineers and commanders were responding to losses with real solutions. That trust mattered in a campaign where morale was constantly tested. For the ball turret gunners themselves, the psychological burden was immense. They carried the knowledge that their role was both critical and uniquely dangerous. Many coped through dark humor, others through ritual, routines before missions, small superstitions, quiet moments alone before climbing into the turret. After missions, the release was intense. Hands shook, voices cracked. Some gunners struggled to sleep. Others relived moments of tracer fire and spinning fighters again and again, but they returned, because they believed it mattered, and because, increasingly, it did. The ball turret didn't make crews fearless. It made them feel defended. In a war fought at altitude and under constant threat, that belief could be the difference between cohesion and collapse. The ball turret's true value extended far beyond individual dogfights beneath a single bomber. It helped keep the entire daylight bombing campaign alive. By late 1942 and early 1943, U.S. Army Air Forces faced a strategic crisis. Losses were climbing at a rate that could not be sustained. Crews were running out faster than they could be trained. Aircraft were being destroyed faster than factories could replace them. Daylight precision bombing, the cornerstone of American air strategy, was on the brink. The ball turret was part of the solution. By closing the last major gap in the B-17's defensive coverage, it reduced the effectiveness of German interception tactics. Survivability improved not dramatically overnight, but consistently. Fewer bombers were lost per mission. More crews completed their tours. That mattered strategically. Every bomber that returned meant experience preserved. Veteran crews were more effective, more disciplined, and more accurate. They trained new arrivals, they refined tactics, they raised the overall quality of the force. The ball turret also helped maintain formation integrity. Bombers that felt defensible stayed in formation longer. Stragglers decreased. Mutual firepower remained dense. This directly increased bombing effectiveness and reduced vulnerability to piecemeal destruction. Strategic bombing is cumulative. Factories are not destroyed in one raid. Infrastructure collapses over time. Oil shortages, transportation breakdowns, and industrial disruption require sustained pressure. The ball turret helped make that pressure sustainable. It bought time until other decisive factors arrived. Long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang, improved navigation, better intelligence, and overwhelming production capacity. When those elements came together, the air war tipped decisively in the Allies' favor. Without survivable bombers, none of that would have mattered. The ball turret also influenced aircraft design philosophy. It demonstrated that defensive systems could shape enemy behavior, that denying safe attack angles could be as powerful as raw firepower. Future aircraft would incorporate lessons about coverage, redundancy, and crew survivability learned at enormous cost. Strategically, the ball turret symbolized a broader truth of World War II air combat. Victory belonged not to the fastest adaptation, but to the side that adapted continuously. The flying fortress survived not because it was perfect, but because it evolved. As the war in Europe moved toward its final phases, the ball turret's role began to change. By 1944, long-range Allied fighter escorts, especially the P-51 Mustang, could accompany bombers deep into Germany and back. Luftwaffe fighters faced interception before they ever reached the bomber streams. Air superiority slowly, then decisively, shifted. The ball turret was no longer the bomber's last line of defense, but that did not make it obsolete. Even with escorts, German fighters still broke through. Flak remained deadly, and when escorts were delayed, weathered out, or drawn away, the flying fortress still relied on its own guns. The ball turret continued to deny the underside, the most lethal angle of all. After the war, the ball turret became one of the most debated features of the B-17. Critics pointed to its dangers: the extreme vulnerability of the gunner, the difficulty of escape, the psychological toll of isolation and exposure. Supporters pointed to the results. Losses dropped after its introduction. Enemy tactics changed. Crews survived attacks that would once have been fatal. Both were true. In peacetime evaluations, the ball turret was seen as a product of its moment, a necessary solution to a specific problem in a specific war. Jet aircraft, missiles, and radar would soon make slow, heavily armed bombers obsolete. Defensive gun turrets vanished from modern aircraft design. But the legacy endured. The ball turret became an icon of World War II aviation, a symbol of the human cost of air warfare and the lengths to which engineers and crews went to survive. Museums preserved them. Veterans told stories. Filmmakers and historians returned to the image again and again, a lone gunner suspended beneath a bomber, fighting the sky itself. For those who flew with them, the legacy was simpler. The ball turret was fear, and salvation, claustrophobia, and protection, risk, and necessity. It represented the harsh arithmetic of war. One man placed in extreme danger so others might live. That calculation, uncomfortable as it is, shaped the air war over Europe. High above Europe, the air war was decided not just by engines and bombs, but by angles. For a time, the underside of the bomber belonged to the enemy. It was a place of certainty, where fighters attacked knowing the odds were in their favor. The ball turret ended that certainty. It didn't make the B-17 invincible. It didn't remove fear or risk or loss. What it did was simpler and more profound. It gave the bomber a voice beneath its belly, a warning, a deterrent, a deadly answer to an assumed weakness. Inside that steel sphere, young men fought in isolation, curled into impossible spaces, staring down at a world that wanted them dead. They endured cold, fear, and the constant awareness that escape might never come. And still, they fired. Because every fighter driven away meant a bomber stayed in formation. Every burst of tracer fire meant a crew might make it home. Every denied attack angle shifted the balance just a little further. Enemy fighters thought the B-17 was a sitting duck, until the sky beneath it erupted in fire.